3 weeks ago, I was standing in a cutting unit with a saw that had about 4 minutes of battery left in it, a job still half done, and the nearest outlet about 11 miles away at my own kitchen counter. That's the moment that got me thinking about this whole video, so let's just get into it. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because I talk about this kind of practical, no-nonsense, off-grid stuff pretty regular. I've done a video before walking through the 3 basic components of a small solar setup: the panel, the battery, and the charge controller, and that one's still the easiest way to learn the actual wiring if you've never touched any of this before. Go watch that one if you need the fundamentals, positive to positive, negative to negative, all of it. This video's not that video. This one's about doing it the way my grandfather would have done it if he'd had the parts available to him. Which is to say, dead simple, built for abuse, and built to work in the woods, not on a nice level driveway with good open light. Because that's the thing nobody tells you when you first get into solar. Almost every tutorial out there gets filmed in a parking lot or up on a rooftop with a clean shot at the sky. My work happens under a canopy. Yours might too if you're doing anything out in timber country, and that changes more than people think it does. My grandfather, Walt, logged this same ground for most of his working life, long before I was born and for a good while after. He used to keep this beat-up little gas generator strapped down in the bed of his truck, and every single morning out on a job. Before the saws even started, the first thing he'd do was drag that generator out, get it running, and let it idle the whole shift just so there'd be juice for the battery charger and a hot plate for coffee at lunch. I remember one November when it was raining sideways and that generator would not catch. He must have pulled that cord 40 times, cussing at it under his breath in that flat, patient way he had, where you almost couldn't tell he was mad until you knew him well enough to notice his jaw doing that thing it did. Finally got it running, and he stood there dripping, looked at me and said something like, "Someday somebody's gonna figure out how to get power out here without dragging around a machine that hates the rain as much as we do." He wasn't wrong. He just wasn't around long enough to see it happen. So here's the old logger's way, the way I actually build these now for job sites and backcountry camps. And it starts with admitting the biggest problem you're going to have out in the woods, which is shade. Not clouds, shade. There's a difference, and it matters more than you'd think. A cloud dims the whole sky evenly. Every panel gets the same haircut. A stand of Douglas fir does something meaner. It throws hard, moving shadows across just part of your panel. And that's a much bigger problem than it sounds like. Solar cells are wired together in a string, kind of like old Christmas lights. And when even one cell in that string gets fully shaded, it doesn't just lose its own little share of the power. It can drag down the output of the whole string right along with it, sometimes cutting a panel's production by half or more from what looks like a pretty small, harmless-looking shadow. Out here, with limbs moving in the wind all day long, that shadow is never sitting still either. It's here, then it's over there, then it's back again 5 minutes later. Anybody building a system for open sky doesn't have to think about any of this. Anybody building one for the woods has to think about it from day one, or they end up disappointed and blaming the wrong thing. I learned that one the hard way myself a few years back before I really understood any of it. I set up a little panel under some tan oak thinking it'd be fine. Same wattage as the one I was running out in the open at the house, figured it'd charge about the same. It did not charge about the same. It limped along at a fraction of what I expected, and for about a week I was convinced the panel itself was junk, secondhand and defective, before I finally figured out the problem wasn't the panel at all. It was 3 branches, moving about 4 feet in the wind, throwing a shadow across one corner of it for a few minutes out of every hour. Didn't look like much, cost me most of my output anyway. On top of the shade problem, forest sites hand you a second. One that nobody talks about either, which is just how dirty the air is out there compared to a rooftop. Pollen in the spring, dust off the roads in summer, and if you're anywhere near fir or pine, a fine haze of sap mist that settles on everything within about 30 feet of a saw running all day, including your panel. None of that is dramatic on its own, a little haze, a little grit, but it sits right on top of the glass and cuts into your output the same way a thin coat of grime on a windshield cuts into how much you can actually see through it. I wipe mine down at the start of most shifts now, takes about 10 seconds with a rag, and it's become as automatic as checking my chain tension before I ever pull the cord. It's not a step you'll find in any manual. It's a step you learn from watching your numbers slowly drift down over a couple of weeks and wondering why, before you finally look down and realize the panel's just filthy. That's where the charge controller earns its money. And it's also where I'll admit I've gone back and forth on advice I've given before. There are two main kinds you'll run into, PWM and MPPT. PWM is the cheaper, older technology, and for a small panel sitting in full open sun, it does the job fine. No complaints, no need to spend more than you have to. MPPT is the smarter, pricier option, and instead of just letting the panel's voltage fall in line with the battery, it constantly hunts around for the actual sweet spot in voltage and current coming off that panel, chasing the best possible output even as conditions shift. In good open light, that difference might only be worth a handful of percentage points. Not enough to justify the extra cost for a lot of folks with a clean rooftop setup. But under a canopy, in patchy moving shade, in the cold mornings, we get up here where the panel's putting out a weird voltage the PWM controller can't fully use. That gap widens out to something like 15 to 30% more usable power. That is not a rounding error. That's the difference between a battery that's topped off by early afternoon and one that's still sitting at 60% when you're trying to run a headlamp at dark. If you're setting up in your backyard with a wide open shot at the sky, save your money, go PWM, spend the difference on more panel instead. If you're setting up anywhere with trees hanging over it, spend the extra money on the MPPT. I didn't used to feel that strongly about it. The woods changed my mind, and they'll change yours too if you fight this the hard way like I did. Comment down below where you're watching this from, because I'm always curious how many of you are dealing with real tree cover versus wide open country, and whether that changes how you'd build a rig like this. Now the battery, because this is the other place the old loggers way and the modern way really part ways. My grandfather's whole operation ran on lead acid, because that's what existed at the time. Heavy, fussy things that didn't love the cold and didn't love getting jostled around in the back of a pickup all day on logging roads that are really just suggestions of where a road ought to be. What we've got now is lithium iron phosphate, LiFePO4, if you want to sound fancy down at the feed store, and it's built different, almost literally different in how it's put together. It handles vibration and rough handling a lot better than the old lead-acid style ever did, which matters more than people give it credit for when your power system is riding around in a truck bed over washboard roads and stump holes all day instead of sitting still on a shelf in a garage somewhere. The one thing it does not love is charging in freezing temperatures. Most of these batteries have some kind of internal protection circuit that just refuses to accept a charge below freezing, full stop, doesn't matter how much sun you throw at the panel. Some of the newer ones come with a built-in heating element to get around that exact problem, and if you're working in genuine winter conditions, that feature is worth paying extra for. If you're not, you can just bring the battery into the cab overnight instead of leaving it in the truck bed, which is the old logger's way of solving that particular problem, meaning it costs nothing and requires zero engineering, just a little bit of remembering. Sizing this thing for actual job site use is a different math problem than sizing it for a cabin or an RV, and this is where I think people way overcomplicate it. You don't need to run your whole life off this. You need to keep saw batteries topped up, a headlamp charged, maybe a radio, maybe a phone so you can check the weather before you drive an hour up a mountain for nothing. Let's just run the actual numbers so this isn't just me waving my hands at you. Say you're charging 2 saw batteries a day, call it 80 watt-hours apiece. That's 160. A headlamp and a radio together might pull another 40 over the course of a shift. Round it up for good measure, call it 250 watt-hours a day you actually need. Now divide that by how many hours of usable light you're realistically getting under cover, and I want to stress the word realistically, because on a shaded site that might only be 3 or 4 decent hours instead of the 6 or 7, you'd get out in the open. 250 divided by 4 is about 65 watts continuous. And once you account for the losses, you always lose somewhere in the wiring, the controller, the connections. You're looking at something in the neighborhood of 100 to 150 watts of actual panel to comfortably cover that, with a battery size to carry you through a rainy stretch without a charge on top of it. Most job site setups like this land somewhere between 200 and 400 watts of panel total once you build in a little cushion for a cloudy week, and that's not a big rig. That's a folding panel, one decent battery, and a controller, all of which can live in a job box and come out when you actually need them. Now, if you're running this for a whole crew instead of just yourself, the math scales up, but it doesn't get any more complicated. It just gets bigger. Say you've got 3 guys. Each cycling saw batteries through the day, plus a couple of headlamps and a radio that's on more than it's off. You're probably closer to 700, maybe 800 watt-hours a day once you add it all up honestly, which under that same 3 or 4 hours of usable shaded light puts you in the neighborhood of 200 watts of continuous draw. And that's where you start looking at either a bigger single panel, a pair of panels wired together, or just accepting that the battery bank needs to be bigger so it can bank some surplus on the one good sunny afternoon you get that week to carry you through the 2 gray ones that follow it. There's no shame in oversizing the battery a little more than the math says you strictly need. Batteries are cheap insurance against a week of bad weather. Panels are what you size tight, because more panel doesn't help you on a day with no sun anyway. It only helps you catch up faster once the sun does show back up. Here's the part that would have made my grandfather's whole week. And it's the part that actually makes this feel like the old logger's way instead of some over-engineered van life setup with mood lighting. None of this needs to be mounted to anything permanent. The panel folds up and leans against a stump or a tailgate wherever the light's actually breaking through that day, which changes as the day goes and as the season goes, so you learn to read the canopy the same way you'd read a stand of timber before you fell it, figuring out where the gaps are, where the light's landing on the ground at 10 in the morning versus 2 in the afternoon. And you move the panel to chase it the way you'd move a lawn chair to chase the shade on a hot day, just backwards. The whole rig, panel, battery controller breaks down into something you can carry in one trip and set up in about the time it takes to drink half a thermos of coffee. My grandfather's generator took 2 people and a bad back to load and unload every single day. This takes 1 guy, and about the time it takes to drink half a thermos of coffee, twice, because you'll want the second cup once it's running, and you're just standing there watching a little green light blink, instead of pulling a cold, wet starter cord for the 40th time in a row. One thing I'd add here, because a few of you asked about this after that last solar video, keep your cable runs and your connectors up off the ground and away from anywhere equipment's actually moving. A logging site is not a clean environment the way a driveway is. Things get dragged, things get stepped on, chain gets thrown, slash piles get shoved around by a machine that doesn't know or care what's underneath them, and a cable pinned under a rolling log or run over by a truck tire is a problem you don't want to discover halfway through a shift when you reach for power and get nothing. I run mine along the same kind of line I'd run a hose, up off the ground, tied off out of the way, out of the path of anything that moves or gets dragged. It's not glamorous advice. It's just the kind of thing you only really learn by having it happen to you once, and I have had it happen to me once, which is exactly 1 time more than I'd recommend. Same idea applies to the connectors themselves. The little plug-and-play ends that come standard on most panel cables are fine sitting still on a rooftop for 20 years, but they're not built with a logging crew's boots in mind. So I've started using the heavier locking versions on anything that's going to live in a truck bed or get dragged around a landing all season. Costs a little more up front. Saves you from finding a connector cracked in half on the one day you actually need power, which somehow is always the day it rained the hardest the night before. For folks who don't want to mess with wiring a raw battery and controller together at all, there's also the option of just running one of these all-in-one portable power stations instead. The kind with the battery, the controller, and the outlets all built into one box already. You lose a little bit of that pure old logger, build it with your hands simplicity, but you gain the ability to hand it to somebody on the crew who's never touched a wire in their life and have them run it without you standing over their shoulder worrying about polarity. There's a place for both approaches out here. I run a raw wired system on my own truck because I like knowing exactly what's happening inside the box. And I keep one of the all-in-one units around for anybody else on a job who just wants power without a lesson in electrical theory first. Getting all this between units matters just as much as setting it up once you're there. I keep mine in a plain steel job box bolted down in the truck bed, Foam cut out to fit the battery and controller snug so nothing's rattling around loose while I'm bouncing up some old spur road that hasn't seen a grader since before I was born. The panel ride's folded flat underneath everything else, glass side protected, because a cracked panel out here isn't something you drive to town and swap same day. You're running the old setup, or you're running nothing until you can get back to civilization. My grandfather never had that particular worry, since you can't really crack a steel generator tank by looking at it wrong, but he had his own version of it, which was making sure that thing was strapped down tight enough it didn't tip over and dump gas all through his truck bed on a steep grade. Every generation's got its own thing to double check before it pulls out of the yard. I want to be honest about the limits of all this too, because I don't think it does anybody any favors to oversell it. This is not going to run a full shop. It's not going to power a mill or charge a truck battery from dead. What it replaces is the small stuff, the stuff that used to require dragging a whole generator out just to top off a couple of saw batteries and keep the coffee hot. And for that job, it is genuinely better in almost every way that matters. Quieter, which matters more than you'd think when you're trying to hear a widowmaker creaking up in the canopy before it decides to come down. No fuel to haul, no fuel to spill on the tailgate, no cord to pull 40 times in the rain while you stand there getting soaked and questioning every decision that led you to that particular job. My grandfather spent decades solving problems with whatever was actually available to him at the time, and his solutions were always simple because the ground he worked never left room for anything complicated or fussy. I think if he'd had this option sitting in front of him, he'd have taken one long look at it, grunted, and gone right back to work without another word, which from him was about as high a compliment as any piece of gear could ever earn. I'll put together a proper parts list video soon, going through exactly which folding panel, which controller, and which battery I actually run on my own rigs now. Because I know a description full of links isn't quite the same as somebody just telling you straight what they'd buy with their own money. For now, if you're building something for open sky, keep it simple and go cheap on the controller. If you're building it for the woods, spend the extra money where it actually counts, because the shade doesn't care how good your intentions are, and neither did that generator, and neither did the rain that November. I'm Cole Ashford. Thank you for listening.